Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Navigating T86 Section 321 and the Potential Regulatory Changes. My name is Jenn Park, and I am the Director of Flexport Trade Advisory Practice. We have a great webinar for you today, but before we begin, let's cover a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you will see a sidebar to the right of the main stage. If at any time you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in the help chat located at the sidebar. You can also ask questions via the Q&A tab on the sidebar. Time permitting, at the end of the presentation, we will answer a few audience questions. Be sure to get your questions in early. In the menu above the screen, you have two tabs. In the first tab, you can download a copy of today's slide deck, and in the second tab, there's a brief feedback survey for this webinar. We love your feedback, so please fill that out before exiting the webinar. Now, a brief legal note. Please keep in mind that all information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Joining me today is Marcus Eeman, Senior Global Customs Manager and leader of our Flexport de minimis program.
Yeah, thanks, Jen.
Here is today's agenda. We will start by exploring what is 321, followed by on what de minimis looks like today and in the future. Next, we'll dive into tariffs, what the landscape looks like today, what we can expect starting January 20th, and we'll wrap up with a review of compliance requirements and some practical tips. Finally, we'll open up the floor for a Q&A session. So let's dive right in. Marcus, I'll hand it off to you to discuss what is de minimis.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. We're going to start out by just doing a repeating of a slide that we've done before in the past, just to make sure everybody still kind of has a good understanding. I don't want to, we have a full slide deck today, so I don't want to spend too much on this, but just to kind of understand, okay, I hear de minimis, I hear type 86, I hear 321. What are the differences? What do they mean? What do I need to know? De minimis is the overarching terminology. It comes from Section 321 of the Trade Act, saying that there's certain shipments that are of minimal importance to CBP and are therefore exempt from traditional reporting requirements and the other requirements that you are used to on standard freight entries. Within that overarching umbrella of de minimis, they come in three different flavors. The first one is manifest clearances. This is one where a carrier or sometimes a broker provides customs with a list of the packages they want to see released, and it can be any method: air, ocean, rail, environment. This is very common if you have a 3PL setup, with a trucker in Mexico or one in Canada. They do fulfillment from Canada or Mexico. That's probably what you're using. This also is probably more the case with the express consignment carriers, the very large parcel carriers who have different setups, and they have different arrangements that are a little bit more specific to them. I'm going to talk about manifest a little bit. The main one that we also see quite a lot of is one that we do here at Flexport, and it's called the Type 86 entry. And the Type 86 entry was originally created to handle PGA information because the manifest clearances didn't really have a capability to send that through in the same ACE environment that Customs uses for regular entries. So this happened, and then this was a big part of the reason why we've seen a large growth in Type 86, in de minimis entries overall in the last few years, is because people figured out, okay, this Type 86, I can use it for PGAs, but I don't have to send a PGA message set. I can just send the parcel information, and me as a broker, I can get the same release that those large express consignment carriers have historically gotten. And the third one is a Section 321 data pilot. So you may hear Section 321 and think it's this. This is a bit more of a niche pilot that Customs tried to run on their own. This was for a small group of importers to file their own de minimis entries, but there were non-PGA versions of this. So they had to kind of apply for this program. They had to meet certain criteria. There could be no partner government agency PGA requirements, and then they could be part of it. But we're really focused on the manifest clearances and a little bit more even on Type 86. So with that, let's take a look at the present and future, starting with the present. Where are we? Well, I think there's a stereotype out there that I want to dispel a little bit, that the government is always slow, they're inept, they're not very responsive to changing circumstances. I think what's happened in the last 10 months on de minimis is actually probably a good counter case study in that, where the government actually was pretty responsive. Last year, they saw over 1 billion parcels. They're expecting another 1.5 billion parcels the next year. of de minimis packages coming in. They did respond accordingly. They've gotten better enforcement. They've gotten smarter enforcement in a lot of different ways. One is they tightened up timeline for Type 86 and other manifest clearances based in the air environment. They have to be filed before arrival. They're starting to identify suppliers with additional information as part of the ACAS, the Advanced Air Cargo Screening Process, to surface this information sooner to customs. They've been asking for a little bit more data. Another one that we've been seeing is they've really targeted vague descriptions or bad descriptions. So you couldn't just say, clothing anymore. You had to specify woven women's dresses or something similar to that effect, right? You have to, and also, is it cotton or is it polyester? They've been looking for more and better descriptions, and they've been enforcing it when they haven't been seeing it. They've been rejecting entries back to brokers for correction. Another one that we've seen is just more focus on the manifest clearances. Historically, the data requirements have been a little bit light on these manifest clearances, but this is definitely one where customs has wanted to tighten up a little bit further, and is definitely the target of a lot of the proposed changes that we're going to get to. They've also been looking for addresses. They've been running that against postal service databases. They've also been looking for consignee name duplicates in shipments. So if you have multiple packages, right, the limit's $800 per day. I think I've glossed over that, but I think if you're coming to this one, you maybe already know at least that headline stat. They had this $800 limit. Okay, is John Smith importing two $500 packages in the same day? Being able to prevent that second entry, they're looking into that. The final one I think is maybe left that they haven't quite gotten to yet. It's not on a customs deployment roadmap, but could still be coming soon. Is this cross-shipper, cross-shipment targeting where, okay, we have John Smith ordering $500 from company A, we have him ordering $500 from company B. The company B shipment should probably be denied, but customs doesn't have a way to know that John Smith ordered over $800 in value, but they are working on it. They have all this information. They just haven't quite been able to bring it together across multiple shippers, across multiple suppliers, across multiple different modes. So they're working on it. I'm sure they'll figure it out. They've done really well, I think, so far in trying to navigate this and at least just put in some very basic common sense practices in their enforcement, and it's going to continue. But there are limits to what they can do, and with that, they've turned to Congress and other branches of the government, the president, to see how can we enforce this better. One is called the Fighting for America Act. If there's one piece of legislation to follow closely, it's probably this one. The brief history is that there were several proposals by different lawmakers. They all set their past ones aside. They all worked and collaborated together on one called the Fighting for America Act, which was introduced by Senator Wyden just recently in the lame duck session. This would do a few things. It would increase the data requirements for reporting here. It would introduce a $2 per parcel fee. It would deny de minimis treatment to any apparel products, no matter which country of origin. It would deny de minimis treatment to anything Section 232 or 301. And it would also simplify the seizure and forfeiture process as well. The second batch here is Biden's rulemaking that he announced in September. We thought there was going to be a quick update. I remember we kind of said, okay, last webinar, maybe this is going to happen soon. Didn't quite happen as soon as we thought, but we are expecting this to happen. Probably, we could see something in later December, early January, pre-inauguration. We may see some rulemaking set forth from customs. This would also allow for denying de minimis to Section 301 to 232, increased data requirements, and specifically HTS on manifest clearances where they haven't been required before. That would be a big change as well. And we haven't had anything public from Trump on Section 321 directly. We're gonna talk Trump in kind of what this might mean in just a few slides here, but he hasn't specifically spoken on this point. It's likely, however, that whatever his other actions are on this space will probably affect de minimis in some capacity, even if he just leaves some of this Biden rulemaking in place and doesn't alter its trajectory. There will still be some restrictions. So, okay, there's a lot of possible options out there, but what is it actually going to look like? What are our likely scenarios? What are our unlikely scenarios? And how impactful will they be? Well, we have a few options here. The left side is more kind of the soft reform possibilities. So these are the things that maybe you don't see every day, but they are simmering in the background. So one is just maybe more data requirements that we've already kind of talked about. Can they do that cross-shipper matching and identifying parcels and combining values? That's one. Improving targeting, supplier identifier verification as well. Are they going to look for this a little bit better? Are they going to try to say, like, okay, we now know not to reject a package going to 3A apartment, but also allow the one 3B. We've seen some mismatches there where customs has erroneously rejected 321 based on subtle differences in address like that. And then the third one is we're also going to see increased holds, exams, and forfeiture as well. I think this is one that we're going to see more of because that Fighting for America Act and even the Biden rulemaking want to make it easier for customs to be able to seize packages. The reason why is when customs wants to seize a shipment, there's a CBP director, Pullum, estimated it costs about $1,100 to go through that seizure protocol. And that's the same if it's a 10 container shipment that's being seized or a single $8 parcel. So they have to spend $1,100 of man hours to enforce a seizure of goods and deny it and go to the destruction process, which is insane. They want to be able to allow it faster. It makes sense if you think about it in the cargo world where, okay, there should be an appeals process. Maybe they figure it out. Can somebody satisfy customs in some regard? But in this case here, it really doesn't matter when these parcels are just not being cleared, they're not being picked up, CBP is holding them, and the consignee never comes for them ever again. They just never come back to it. So that'd be a huge cost savings just by reducing some of that administrative burden for CBP. The hard reform possibilities here on the right-hand side, these are ones that probably do show up every day, that you're going to have to make business decisions over this information. 301, 232 being denied. De minimis being denied to textile goods, a $2 per parcel fee, or customs bond requirements for de minimis shippers. Higher data requirements being enforced by penalty is another one that probably goes not just from more data, but if you aren't providing the right data or you're getting it wrong, customs could penalize you for doing so. If you're not or if you are negligent, if you're not showing care, they could potentially assess a penalty. As well as we have some less likely options that I know were thrown around. I just want to say, like, we're not going to say these would never happen, but they may not happen, and they may be a little bit less likely to. One that was thrown around there was identifying consignees by social security number or other kind of unique identifier. That's not a horrible idea, just a little bit impractical, and then it gets into some really murky territory. It's like, well, what if you don't have a social security number? What if you're an immigrant here on a legal work visa, you're staying over, are you not allowed de minimis anymore? It gets into some murky territory, so that's probably unlikely, but that was at least proposed earlier. Targeting a specific country is also something we're probably not going to see, like targeting China. In effect, they will be targeted, but not directly in name. So practically speaking, China is going to be targeted, but it's unlikely to say, okay, we're going to go after this one particular country of origin. We may just look at it from a broader sense. Anything subject to 301 or 232, like China, those might be the way that we actually see that being enforced rather than country of origin specific rules. Another one that's probably less likely is designating specific ports. CBP said early on they really like the express consignment facilities. You know, if you've ever seen some of those FedEx operations or UPS or something, they go to these facilities. They're on site every day. They're pulling packages off the line, inspecting at will. Maybe they want to do something like that on a broader scale. Doesn't seem as likely. It would require a lot more infrastructure build out. CBP would need some partnerships and maybe to be new classes of warehousing open up. It's a bigger hassle, and I know it was thrown out there, but I haven't seen anything that makes me think that's likely. And then the final one is just a revival of an FTZ-based fulfillment plan. That was also put forward. FTZ lobby groups wanted to say, okay, you can do fulfillment, but it has to go to an FTZ first. That also doesn't really seem to have gotten much traction. It's not in the Wyden bill. It's not in what Biden's talking about. It could still happen, but at this point, it doesn't really look very, very likely to occur. So that's a little bit about the de minimis kind of landscape today and kind of what we think that immediate future is. We also know this call came, or we had this webinar scheduled after the election. So we now know who the president's going to be, and we have heard quite a lot from our president-elect Trump on what he wants to do or plans to do. So maybe, Jen, will you tell us a little bit about, broader from de minimis, is what's the tariff landscape today? What's maybe the tariff landscape in the immediate future?
Yep, thanks, Marcus. All right, we'll start with going over the tariff landscape today. On the next slide, you'll see that we have listed Section 301, 201, and 232s. As you all know, these were all implemented during Trump's first administration. They are currently still active. It carried through the Biden administration. We don't see these going away anytime soon. We're not going to go through each one, but wanted to kind of highlight what Trump has done during his previous administration, what we can kind of expect. For the 301s, one thing that we want to highlight is that the USTR did conclude their 4-year review earlier this year in May, sorry. And what they did say is that China's policies and practices were continuing to burden the U.S. commerce, so that these tariffs will remain. And what they have also done is increase or add additional tariffs under 301s, right? So we had new products. I think they were mostly focused on electric vehicles, solar cells. And as of September 27th of this year, we started to see some of those new tariffs come into play. We know that there are supposed to be more coming in 2025 and 2026. Those are TBD, as we know that the Trump administration will continue, but we have no idea in terms of how they will change the landscape of Section 301 during their administration. So that's something that we want to keep our eyes on during his term. In the next slide, we'll kind of cover what we're hearing today with Trump. So as we all know, Trump is always a big fan of tariffs. He's talked about tariffs during his first administration, during his campaign, post-election. So if you see on slide 13, you'll see some of the quotes that that Trump has quoted in the past. And I think the most recent one is what was published, or I guess announced in X, where he said that he will implement potentially 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, and also additional 10% on China goods. And then next, we'll kind of discuss how serious are these threats, right? Trump has already signaled in the past that his primary tool is tariff to kind of advance the U.S. and foreign domestic policy goals. He's never been shy talking about tariffs and using tariffs as a way to kind of get his way, right? He's already implemented it historically. So we don't see that this is something that is new to him, but something he feels very comfortable discussing, comfortable implementing. So are his tactic, or is this a negotiating tactic? Yes, we do believe so. We know that previously in his first administration in 2019, he did the same thing with Mexico, where he was going to impose, I believe, a 5% tariff on Mexico goods. That was in order to address the immigration issue at the border. And I believe, we didn't see those tariffs coming into play because he did say that they were able to come to a conclusion on that. But it is something that he did leverage in order to kind of get his way, right, on the immigration issue. We see that today as well on that 25% from Mexico and Canada. The reason why he's imposing or trying to implement those 25% tariffs is around immigration, around drug trafficking, right? And once he announced that, we've seen both the president from Mexico and the prime minister from Canada reaching out to Trump to start negotiating, to start discussions, right? To see if there's anything they can do in terms of trying to get rid or lower those tariffs before they come into play. And so they are trying to play ball here. So we do see this more of a negotiation tactic today. There's also the madman theory that Marcus had put up there. It is a strategy that Trump used. For those that don't know what the madman theory is, it's something that was associated with Nixon, where he made leaders think that he was irrational, volatile, so that they would avoid provoking the U.S. in fear of any unpredictable response from him, right? And so we see that with president as well, with the president-elect Trump, where his unpredictable behavior is sometimes in his advantage, right? Where some countries will believe that some of these unbelievable threats of these tariffs are more credible when it comes from Trump, right? We've seen him during his first administration implement these tariffs fairly quickly, and it's something that we haven't seen during the previous administrations. So that is something that he used during his first. It's something that we can probably see during his second term to get his way. So we'll kind of monitor that. In terms of whether he will follow through on these threats. We also know that Trump is not shy with actually implementing the tariffs. In the previous slide, we saw that there are 3 different rounds of tariffs that he has implemented. It is possible, but it is something that Trump has always used, right, to get his agenda through. So it is something that he can also do very quickly. He hasn't really relied on Congress to implement these tariffs. He's done it, through executive orders. So it is something that he can do on his own. And as you know, Trump, he has a pretty big ego. So there's something that he does. We always see that he wants to kind of control, wants to be at the forefront, kind of leading those discussions, being the one kind of saying, I implement these for our for the America First agenda. So we do see that it is something that is real threat that it could come into play during his administration. There's also bipartisan support from Congress on implementing tariffs, especially with China, right? We have a very strong stance against China right now. We see it in the legislations that are being proposed for de minimis, but also in just all around. So we do think that there is going to be some sort of tariffs coming into play. We just don't know when or who will be impacted, but we do believe that tariffs are going to be part of the second administration for Trump. I guess the question here is how much, who's going to be impacted. It's all unknown at this time, right? There's speculation. Trump always proposes implementing tariffs, and he, goes back once the negotiations are completed, or sometimes he just implements tariffs pretty quickly. So I think the uncertainty is what's causing a lot of companies right now to be concerned with how to prepare. But I think right now it is more of a wait and see to see what Trump actually does once he's in office. But as we kind of prepare for that, the question that I think everyone has is, does Trump actually have the authority to implement these tariffs? And so we'll kind of go through that in the next slide on what ways he can actually implement these tariffs. The question here is, can this happen under Trump? Can he actually implement these tariffs as a president? I think the answer is yes. Historically, while Congress has a primary authority to implement tariffs, in the past we've seen that it has delegated significant authority to the president to modify some of these tariffs in play, and the mechanisms that are available for the president to implement these tariffs are outlined here on this slide. We'll kind of go through each one. We won't go into much detail, but I do kind of want to touch on how he's able to implement the tariffs, because through these different avenues, because it will change it'll be different in terms of what products will be impacted, which countries, what the timeline will look like, because there's different procedural requirement for some of these. So starting with Section 122, this one, the law allows the president to impose additional tariffs up to 15% on imports from countries in which the U.S. has a large and serious imbalance of payment deficits, right? So this one does not require any sort of investigation by Congress or any other government, so it is something that he can move very quickly to implement. We all know that in 2023, I think the statistics came out where the trade deficit with China was about 279 billion or so. So it is something that he can implement against countries where there is a trade deficit. So this is something that he could use right away and implement tariffs fairly quickly. But the thing here is that he can only implement up to 15%. And I think there is only 150 days in which the tariffs can come into play unless Congress decides to extend. So there's also that time limit. The next one is the 301s and the 232s, which shouldn't be a surprise, because he has used this during his first administration. And as you know, with the 301s, it allows the president to respond to any unfair foreign trade practices where the foreign government acts are unjustifiable or unreasonable to burden the U.S. commerce. And for 232s, it allows the president to impose any tariffs and quotas where there's a threat to national security. He's done it previously, so it's something that he can do quick. He can also do during this term. However, for these two, it does require an investigation for the 301s by the USTR, for the 232s by the Department of Commerce. So it does take time. However, it is possible for Trump to just modify the existing 301s that are currently in place, which means that he could do that fairly quickly without the investigation. So this is another avenue that he could potentially use to implement the tariffs. One thing we want to call out here is that there is a court case out there, right, on the Section 301 tariffs. There are about, I believe, 6,000 or so importers that are challenging the 301 tariffs today. It's been happening for a few years now, where they say that the tariffs are illegally imposed due to the violations of the Administrative Procedures Act by the USTR. So in 2023, it did go to the U.S. Court of International Trade, where they upheld the legality of the tariffs, which has been now appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals. I believe there are oral arguments that are scheduled to happen January 8th, right after the holidays. So that's pending, and we all know that the court cases do take a very long time. So if Trump does decide to impose new Section 301 tariffs, there is going to be potential that there is going to be another court case against it. So we'll kind of monitor that as well. Another one we want to call out is the 338, which allows the president to implement additional duties up to 50% or ban imports if a foreign country imposes unreasonable restrictions on U.S. goods that disadvantages the U.S. commerce. This does not require an investigation, but does require proof that the U.S. was discriminated against. So it's another avenue that Trump could use. And lastly, we have the IIEPA, which stands for the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It gives the president the authority to address unusual and extraordinary threats to the national security through the by imposing economic sanctions. So this is the broadest authority that's given to the president. So there is no procedural safeguard here and no investigation is required. This is something that President-elect could most likely implement for Mexico and Canada to find that the undocumented, immigration or the drug trafficking are unusual and extraordinary threats to the national security of the U.S. So it's something that he could use, but he will have to prove that, that this is an extraordinary threat to our national security. All right. All right, and then I'll hand it off to Marcus. This is everything we've discussed today is pretty much our speculation in our opinions on what we think based on what we're hearing. It's still uncertain territory of what's to come, but what's our opinion on what we can expect?
Yeah. So Jenn definitely, said like, here's how it can happen. Here's what might go into play here. But this is like the more speculative side. So you can't hold us to any of this here. But this is just Jenn's and I opinion. Everybody has one. There's a saying about that. Expect tariffs on China. Expect de minimis as well to be limited sometime early next year. Tariffs on other countries, I think, are a little bit less to be determined, right? It's just, as Jenn pointed out, Trump can take unilateral action really quickly with tariffs. And he, among many things, is a man of action. He likes to act quickly. He likes to be the person in the front taking charge. This is something that I think he did successfully, or at least successfully in his terms in the first administration. And China will certainly be a focus as well. China skepticism is high. It's very bipartisan, and that there's still just a brewing frustration over trade and wishing that things would be different. And so I think China will be a focus, either directly or indirectly. It will be impacted. So any kind of supply chain running through China is potentially in play. What Trump wants is to see less reliance of the U.S. on China, and he's going to go through his toolbox that Jenn laid out about how to get to that point. The other one is also that court challenges will probably happen to this, because what is an emergency? Is there actually unfair trade circumstances happening, especially as it relates to Mexico or Canada? Maybe or maybe not, but as Jenn pointed out, right, there has been a case on this, on the Section 301 tariffs, saying that it didn't, go by the proper channels and proper procedures, but it's been going for 4 years. The tariffs are still in place. They haven't gotten relief. So even if people are eventually, they win their day in court at some level, it may not come for years. So the practical effect may still be achieved, where we have these burdens of trade, these tariff barriers in place. This could still happen even if a plaintiff is ultimately successful in court. The idea of an injunction being placed, especially if it comes into emergency powers, it's not something courts usually look to do often, but it's possible. But we don't think it's going to be fast enough to grant any kind of relief. Even if you do get money back, you are able to argue your case successfully. We also do think there's at least maybe some ground for limits. Is it the full doom and gloom? Is this a full doomsday scenario where we're totally cut off from the world? Probably not. And we saw this last time around, where Trump threatened but never actually implemented tariffs on popular things: smartphones, TVs, laptops, toys, most kinds of shoes. Some shoes were affected, but most of them were not. These are popular things. People like to have these things. These are great consumer items that nobody really wants to, distort. So you think about, like, is he going to go full limit on everything, 60% on everything? Well, maybe not. He may have certain limits. And you think also about what he said, okay, we're going to do 10 to 20% tariffs on everybody all around the world. Well, we don't grow any chocolate in the United States. chocolate is popular. Is Trump going to make Halloween more expensive? Hard to say. Maybe not. I think that's something that we're not fully expecting to be a complete no holds barred situation. There may at least be some limits that he's willing to entertain. We're just not quite sure where those are. Another thing that we're expecting is a contentious USMCA renewal. USMCA authorized for 7 years in 2019, up for renegotiation in 2026. And it will sunset automatically if it's not successfully reauthorized by the three signatories in 2026. If any one of these countries pulls out of it, then it begins a 10-year expiration through 2036. So you will still be able to have some, USMCA treatment, but it will be, fading away, even if it is taken out. But as Jenn, points out, there's a lot of things going on here. It's not just a simple like economic exchange. It's a question of like, well, how much are China and Mexico going to play ball on limiting China? How much are they going to work with BYD and Xiaomi and the Chinese automakers? Or are they going to stand with the United States and draw a pretty firm line? Canada has said they're going to raise pretty high tariffs. Mexico hasn't quite said the same yet. So it's a question maybe of how closely will they collaborate on other kind of similar trade adjacent matters like immigration or other concerns. The third one that we're kind of expecting is quota. And Trump said, as we showed in the quote there, that tariff was his favorite word in the dictionary. But I wonder, we think that maybe if he goes a little bit earlier in the dictionary here and he finds the words quota, he may find some value here as well. Quota was rolled out under 232 and 301. This was allowed to put restrictions in place, and there's two forms. One is a rate quota, which is you can import a certain amount at a lower duty rate, and then after that it's a high duty rate. The other kind is called an absolute quota. And we wonder about absolute quotas maybe making a bit of a comeback. The idea is that, Jenn pointed out how Trump seems to model himself after Nixon's foreign policy. Not too long after Nixon came Reagan, who successfully used quota in a pretty good way with the Japanese automakers. Quick history lesson back in the 80s, as oil prices rose, Detroit wasn't making fuel-efficient vehicles, but Honda and Toyota, Mitsubishi were making efficient vehicles. They were trying to sell to the United States. They were threatening the bottom lines of Detroit automakers. Absolute quotas were put in place for 4 years, and Reagan made a deal with the Japanese automakers saying, why don't you build your cars here in America instead? And then at the end of this 4 years, we'll lift this quota. But if you don't build your cars here in America, we're going to keep this quota going. Well, the automakers opened plants in the South, followed by a lot of other international brands, Volkswagen, Volvo, BMW. They also opened plants usually in the southern United States as well. So auto manufacturing did return to the United States in exchange for this market access. It's possible to see Trump running a similar playbook here. If Xiaomi or BYD comes to Trump and says, hey, we want to open a 50,000 person plant in Lexington, Kentucky, would you maybe consider removing tariffs for a certain number of years? Maybe Trump considers that enough of a win and says, yeah, we'll allow this here. You build that plant. We'll lift quota restrictions for you and for your parts. If you make it in America, you're good to go. Is that really what he wants, or does he want to punish China? Kind of comes down to see the woods or the trees. But we do expect maybe quota to make a bit of a comeback on certain things. Autos are maybe one, but maybe on some other things as well. Maybe potentially clothing could come back if Congress moves China over to column 2, essentially revoking that most favored nation world trade organization preferred status, or if they're going to go back to apparel quota. We do wonder if this is actually going to be a tool in his toolbox that he's going to discover or rediscover and implement to a much greater extent. So those are kind of our thoughts on what's going to happen here for if you're kind of wondering about that. But let's give you a little bit more practical kind of tips and tricks here. For type 86, I'm just going to go through a few of these here. If you go to the next slide. Real advice, know your products, know your suppliers, and I'd say just be prepared to switch to type 1 entries quickly. So know what those entry data requirements are. For example, if you import art supplies and paint under de minimis? Did you know you have to report the amount of paint in liters? Maybe you didn't know that. Well, you do now. Maybe you should know what that number is so that if you do have to report that on an entry, you'll be ready to go. Second, look to get a customs bond in place. They can be bought fairly cheaply, but they can make it really quick for you to start importing very quickly under a type 1 scenario where duties are owed. And I think the third one is just understand your duty applications. Talk to our trade advisory team, understand what the HTS codes are going to be, know what you might have to pay. And in terms of other kind of planning to pivot, I do have a few questions I'd like to kind of float out there for folks here. Number one, we're talking to a lot of trade compliance professionals, people that maybe haven't thought about this, but make sure you're right size on your physical infrastructure. If de minimis gets shrunk and maybe you can't import everything you wanted to, what are your current 3PL or fulfillment warehousing needs and your current lease obligations? Do you maybe need to shrink that a little bit? Do you need to maybe find a better footprint for your organization? Second, obviously run some pricing exercises. If there's a $2 per parcel fee and duty, what would your new prices have to be? What is your cost of procurement? A third one is maybe consider talking to your buying team about smaller POs. You may get a better deal if you agree to a 10,000 unit monthly purchasing order, but if you're having a 12-month PO and de minimis gets canceled in 3 months, you could really be underwater. Maybe it's worth it to have maybe a 4-month or a 6-month contract instead, just to try to limit that exposure that you're not signing up for an agreement where maybe you can't buy at a profitable rate anymore. Review your products. Which ones maybe no longer make sense for this purpose here? And then the other one is supplier diversification. Are there other suppliers that you maybe could use, that you could trial today to see, okay, can they make us a similar product and could they be ready to ramp production? China's definitely in the crosshairs. Other countries may be impacted, but that's not a sure thing. China is close enough to a sure thing. Other countries, less so. Maybe it's worth trialing, a couple of shipments from a different supplier in a different country just to see if they have the quality that you'd expect for your product and price point. Jenn, do you want to talk to us about the rest of the tariffs?
Yeah. We're running short on time, so I'll try to make this quick. So there are ways that you can prepare for the Trump administration and the tariffs that are incoming, even despite not knowing exactly what's going to come, right? And I think the first one is doing a cost analysis. Have you looked at your historical imports to kind of assess how much duties would be impacted in your future should there be 10%, 25% tariffs? So there is ways that we can do that here at Flexport. If you haven't done an ACE analysis and looked at your ACE report, it shows you how much was declared per year for the past 5 years for entries, but you can, filter that for country of origin, China specifically, let's just say, and see how much entered value was in 2023 for your imports, and then see how much duty was actually paid, how much tariff was paid. And on top of that, you can kind of determine if you were to do a 10% adjustment on that, what kind of duty tariffs increases you're expecting in 2025 should those come into play. I think there's a lot of things you can do in terms of preparing and understanding what kind of costs may be impacted should the tariffs come into play. Always good to understand like what additional how it's going to impact your cost of goods so that you can adequately prepare, your procurement contracts, your sales contracts with your customers, all of that today if needed. I would say classification is very important today, more so than ever. You want to make sure that your products have the correct classification so that you're paying the proper duties, paying the proper tariffs, right? Classification is also tied to other things such as whether it's subject to any anti-dumping, any 232s, 201s. So you want to make sure that the classification on your products are always accurate. When we had our webinars the past few months, we've had additional clients come to us just to do that classification review. And I will say every single time we'll always find clients where they're very confident in their classifications, only to find that they are using an incorrect classification, or we'll find one that's more appropriate for their products, which does lead to duty savings for them retroactively and proactive. So I think doing a classification review is something that you should be doing on an annual basis at least, because of the updates that have happened to the U.S. Tariff schedule, but also globally, 5 years, it's always updated. So you just want to make sure you're staying on top of that. And also, if there's tariff engineering is something that has come into play more so than ever. I know it's impossible to change the entire product without changing its use, aesthetics, all of that. But there are ways where you can change the marketing, change the way that you advertise, but also maybe changing a few components here and there without changing the entire product itself, where you could achieve a new classification with a lower duty rate. So those are some things that a lot of clients are reaching out for today. So if that's something that is of interest to you, that's something that you can explore to kind of lower the tariffs in the future. Another one is country of origin review. I'll couple this with the supply chain shift. As Marcus mentioned on the previous slide, supply chain diversification. If you haven't already had this conversation, it is something that you should be having internally. We've had a lot of companies start this during the first Trump administration, where they're looking to diversify their supply chain. Whether it's changing the sourcing of their products or even some parts of it, or changing the manufacturing assembly of their products. I would say it's very dangerous to have all the sourcing and manufacturing in one country, especially China, at this time. So if there's any way that you can have these discussions today to say, hey, for your products, if there's 10 components, is it possible to change the sourcing of at least 3-4 outside of China? And if for the manufacturing, is there any way to shift the manufacturing outside of China if you're currently doing that today? And looking at other countries. I know right now it's very difficult to say, hey, let's shift it to this particular country because, Mexico, there's potential tariffs. And that was a second choice in terms of, switching the manufacturing over to get the lower tariffs, taking advantage of USMCA. But we see that that's not entirely true today under Trump. So, it's difficult to say where you want to shift, but there are a lot of countries that, are more popular than others in terms of where companies are looking to shift their manufacturing. But I think what's important here is understanding during your manufacturing and supply chain, what is possible for your company to actually shift, right? And is that shift enough to change the country of origin, right? So country of origin, making sure that the origin that you're declaring your products is also accurate is something that you'd want to review today. And there's other cost saving strategies besides what we mentioned, duty drawback, which is very popular, which I think a lot of clients don't take advantage of. But duty drawback is something, if you import and then export, getting those duties back is something that is a good duty savings for you. But there are other ways in which where you're able to reduce your cost savings. If you see this and you're very overwhelmed with, I don't know where to start, feel free to reach out to our trade advisory team based on your supply chain. We're more than happy to be a strategic partner to kind of walk through what options may be more feasible than others and where we can start. Yeah. All right, with that, we will go to Q&A. I know we're really short on time, but we can start with the first question to you, Marcus. A lot of what we talked about here today is focused on Trump. What role do you see for Congress in these tariffs?
That's a good one. I would say, I think ultimately, remember, all of these trade acts and stuff, these are congressional actions, right? Congress wrote these laws. They gave the president this power, and just as easily they could take it away. And I think the question is sort of like, does Congress support this, or are they just not going to get in the way? And I think that's kind of where we sort of are in this spot, is where Congress is. They may not really help Trump do this thing, but are they going to block him? Probably not, unless it gets really, really painful. If farm producers are in America are really hit hard. Well, there's a lot of senators from farm states that maybe are going to try to take issue with that and maybe try to put some limits on this. But I don't necessarily know if I see that outside of what other things that have to happen, like changing revenue codes so they could allow for de minimis enforcement, or potentially for taking away most favored nation for China. That's probably the other thing that would require Congress. So probably a limited role, but there will be some role. Yeah. Yeah. You have let's see here.
All right.
Missing the other ones?
I think there's one here. Do Trump's tariffs impact de minimis regulations? If so, what is the impact?
Uh, not Not directly, perhaps. It certainly is a knock-on effect, I'd say. Like they're not like the Trump's regulations about this. These tariffs, right? De minimis in theory is duty-free, tariff-free. So in that sense, they wouldn't apply, but they could be swept up in it, where if certain rules come into play about how tariffs will or will not be implemented, maybe it's a bit of like a nomenclature thing, right? If China says, or if Trump says everything from China has a tariff now, regardless of de minimis status, well, then is it really de minimis? It's a philosophy question, but practically speaking, then it becomes one of a practicality where, yes, it was, de minimis treatment, that duty-free treatment is just denied anyway because of what he's doing. Maybe the standard duty rates aren't applying anymore, but the new ones are. That may require, customs to kind of reclassify and recode some of what they've been doing for these manifest and Type 86 clearances before, because they're not revenue producing entries. They haven't been able to attach revenue to some of those de minimis ones. So does Trump implement something and have it, affect de minimis? Maybe, but then is it still de minimis? I guess practically though, it certainly could still affect those shipments. Yes.
All right, and then I know there's a question here. It says, what statute did President Trump use for a 5% tariff warning against Mexico? I believe this is back in 2019. For that one, it was the last one that we discussed, which was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of, I believe, 1977. So that's the same one that we were saying he would most likely use if he were to implement those Mexico and Canada tariffs. But obviously, he'll have to show that there is I believe, a threat. So I know we're short on time. We're actually past time. How frequently can you use 321 for shipments, Marcus?
How frequently can you use it? You can use it up to the limit of what's stated, which is per consignee, so per recipient, right? Not per company, but unless the company is a recipient, up to $800 per day. So you can use it every day, multiple times a day, as long as the consignees are different, and as long as the consignees haven't exceeded that $800 threshold. Customs was cracking down on this because that's really the key, is like who's ultimately receiving this goods, who is that package going to. People would put in dummy names historically. 6 months ago they were putting in literally cartoon characters, and customs wasn't able to check this. Now they are checking this. Now they are stopping that, preventing that. So customs has gotten smarter. They've gotten better at this enforcement. But to the question, you can use it as often as you like. Yeah, just make sure the information's right. Yeah.
All right. See, a lot of these questions are on de minimis. So can you please
Okay.
go over the documentation changes for goods under $800?
Some of the documentation changes for goods under $800. I'll go through the ones that we have now. The first one we have now is just better addresses, correct consignee information, which you were always doing. You were always providing true and correct consignee names and addresses, I know, but the bad actors weren't. Another one is the 10-digit HTS code needs to be valid. Right now, we still have to, sometimes when we onboard new Type 86 suppliers, they haven't had to provide this before. Maybe they came from a manifest clearance environment where they haven't had to provide those 10-digit HTS codes before. Now they have to, and they're using codes from the supplier. They have to be valid 10-digit codes. That's one. Another one in terms of like the new requirements on the supplier fields, maybe that's what they were talking about. They're now including supplier codes, which kind of came from enforcing forced labor requirements on de minimis. These would be things, extra information about how to identify a supplier, which goes into risk targeting. So certain suppliers are, known to use or have been known to use or are somehow affiliated with forced labor. They're in trouble. But if you have a supplier that is good, if you get their Duns and Bradstreet number, their legal entity identifier number, maybe their MID code, if you're familiar with that, any of those things could be used as an extra identifier to provide a little bit better information to customs. And when you can provide better, more correct information to customs that helps them do their job, it usually results in faster processing, better releases, better outcomes. It's when you provide less information that customs is looking into a vacuum. They're trying to then sort through some of this bad or missing information. So if you have correct information to provide, especially on an air Type 86 ACAS filing, I'd recommend providing that supplier information. Yeah. Yeah. What else we got? I'm good for another one if you are. Yeah.
Sure. Another one for you.
All right.
If the rule removing goods with Section 301 goods from de minimis eligibility is implemented, how difficult will it be for customs brokers and freight forwarders to accurately identify packages that aren't eligible? What kind of liability could they face if they wrongly enter these goods under 321?
Ooh, okay. So that is a really juicy. This is a good one to end on. We'll do the first half of that. So it was. I'm sorry. Say the first half again, Jen.
Yes, as it says, if removing goods with Section 301 goods from de minimis eligibility is implemented, how difficult will it be for customs brokers and freight forwarders to accurately identify packages that aren't eligible?
Probably difficult. I think in the same way that we rely on importers today to provide us information, we're not opening these packages. We are declaring things. Customs went on the trade call not that long ago, and they said, "Hey, a broker from the community asked the commissioner of e-commerce for customs, saying like, hey, if we import a pill press, an illegal pill press used for fentanyl production, are we the broker in trouble?" Customs said, "No, no, you're not in trouble," which is, I'll come back to it in a second here, but the idea being is that no, like it is going to be tricky for us, but we can only use the information that our customers provide. We can dig in a little bit here, but ultimately we're pretty reliant on what you're providing us. We're going to assume that what you're providing us is correct unless we get information to the contrary. Now, to the second part of that question is who's responsible? Who's in trouble if that isn't followed? Well, that same webinar call where CBP said no, the broker would not be responsible was followed shortly by a greater enforcement of de minimis rules against customs brokers specifically. Maybe you know it. There was a company out there, it was a few months ago, and there's actually been a court case back and forth on this. The customs maybe said that on the call, but in court, customs has had a very different approach. They've been arguing that for those Type 86 shipments, customs brokers are in fact the importers of record. Therefore, they are liable for the data information. They would have to pay penalties if things are going awry, if things aren't right. So that if we did miss a 301 on a de minimis shipment, customs would look to us as both customs broker and importer. This broker has argued their case in court. I am very sympathetic to their side, saying that no, like we aren't the importer. We never were going to own this. We had nothing to do with this. How can we be held responsible? They lost at the first the first court. They sided with CBP. As I understand it, they're appealing the case, which does have some pretty wide implications if that's true. Where it does get into question of like, well, who is actually responsible for this information? Is it the ultimate consignee? Is it me, the company, the shipper? Or is it potentially the customs broker? And that's not a fully settled question yet. Yeah, I'm watching that case very closely. Yeah, yeah. Well, what do you say? Is there one more that's good, or do you want to end it there?
Oh, I guess that's prompting us to close
Okay,
out the webinar session.
we got the music playing. The band's playing us off. Okay.
All right. So I'll close this out today then. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for everyone for attending. We will email everyone a link to the recording tomorrow morning. If you would like to get in contact with the Flexport team, please email us at 321customs@flexport.com for any de minimis needs and advisory@flexport.com for any tariff questions. Thank you again and have a great day.